Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to sit beside you for another quiet hour of reason and reflection. Tell me, is there paper near you tonight? A notebook, perhaps, or a letter waiting to be written? There is something about ink and silence that sharpens the mind wonderfully. Watson understood this well. He knew that the truth of a thing rarely announces itself, but waits patiently for the careful observer. Do subscribe to Watson's Margins, so these evening reflections are always close at hand. Now, settle in. For as the great detective believed, you see, but you do not observe. And that, dear friends, makes all the difference. Chapter 1. The Merchant of Threadneedle Street. It is a peculiarity of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most consequential cases have invariably announced themselves in the guise of the most ordinary. A grey afternoon in late autumn, a visitor of respectable bearing, a matter that appears at first to concern nothing more dramatic than misplaced paperwork. And yet, beneath such unpromising surfaces, Holmes has more than once uncovered the deep, dark workings of human guilt. The affair I am now setting down, which I shall call the case of the vanished ledger, was no exception to this pattern. And I confess that when it began, I had not the faintest presentiment of the moral labyrinth into which it would lead us. It was on a Thursday in November in the year 1895 that I found myself once more at Baker Street. My practice had given me an unusually light morning, and I had fallen into the comfortable habit, one which my wife indulged with characteristic generosity, of calling upon Holmes during such intervals of professional ease. I found him, as was so often the case in those years of his greatest celebrity, standing at the window in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, pipe in hand, gazing down at the street below with that expression of patient, predatory alertness which he wore when no immediate problem occupied his singular mind. "You are at leisure, Watson," said he without turning. "I am," I replied, settling into my customary chair and reaching for the morning paper, which lay disarranged across the hearthrug. "Has nothing of interest come your way?" "3 letters this morning," said Holmes, "all perfectly trivial. A missing spaniel in Kensington, a disputed will in Hertfordshire, and an anonymous communication from someone who believes his neighbour to be a Prussian spy. The spaniel has almost certainly run off with the butcher's dog from the next street. The will is a matter for solicitors, not detectives. And the Prussian spy is, I would wager my microscope, nothing more alarming than a retired professor of Germanic philology." He turned from the window, the faint ghost of a smile upon his thin lips. "I am, as you observe, entirely at leisure." It was at this moment that Mrs. Hudson's measured tread sounded upon the stair, and she appeared in the doorway with the announcement that a gentleman was below who wished to consult Mr. Holmes upon a matter of some delicacy. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson," said Holmes, his eyes brightening perceptibly. And the man who entered our sitting-room a minute later was of perhaps 60 years, well-made and upright in carriage, though the upright bearing spoke less of natural confidence than of habitual self-discipline. He was dressed in the sober, impeccable fashion of the city. Frock coat of fine black wool, white linen of irreproachable quality, a gold watch chain of conservative weight. His face was long and grave, the face of a man accustomed to the bearing of responsibility, with deep-set eyes of a pale grey that were at present shadowed by an anxiety he was plainly endeavouring to suppress. His hands, I noticed as he accepted Holmes's gesture toward the basket chair, were very slightly unsteady. "Mr. Holmes," said he in a voice of cultivated evenness, "I am Alistair Pembroke, senior partner of Pembroke, Bellamy and Associates, and of Threadneedle Street. You will perhaps have encountered our name in the city pages." "I have," said Holmes pleasantly, seating himself opposite and pressing his fingertips together. "A venerable house, established, if I am not mistaken, in the year of the Great Exhibition, and latterly distinguished for its connection with several of the larger colonial railway enterprises. Pray continue, Mr. Pembroke." The visitor glanced at me with a brief, interrogative hesitation. "Dr. Watson is my trusted colleague," said Holmes. "He has my complete confidence, and I would ask you to speak as freely before him as you would before me alone." Pembroke gave a short nod and turned back to Holmes. "I will come directly to the matter," said he. 3 days ago, a ledger was removed from the secured archive room of our firm. I say removed, ye not misfiled, because I have satisfied myself entirely that it is not upon the premises. The volume in question is a private accounts book relating to a period of our firm's history extending from 1887 to 1891. It is bound in green morocco and bears no external label. To any casual observer, it would appear of no particular importance. To me, Mr. Holmes, its disappearance is a source of very considerable distress." Holmes had not moved during this recital. His grey eyes were fixed upon our visitor with an attention that appeared almost languid and was, I knew well, nothing of the sort. "You say the archive is secured," said he. "By what means?" "A Chubb lock of good quality. The key is held by myself and by my secretary, Miss Graves, who has been in my employ for 11 years. The room itself is accessible only through my private office." "And the ledger was last verified to be present on what date?" "On the 14th of this month. Miss Graves had occasion to retrieve a separate volume from the same shelf. She recalls the green ledger distinctly." "And it was discovered absent on?" "The morning of the 17th. I went to consult it myself. The space where it had stood for over 20 years was empty." Holmes rose abruptly from his chair and took several steps towards the fireplace, where he stood for a moment staring into the coals. It was a characteristic motion, the outward expression of some inward adjustment of thought. "You mentioned," said he, turning, "that its loss is a source of distress. You will forgive me, Mr. Pembroke, if I observe that your distress does not appear to me to be primarily financial in character. The loss of an accounts book relating to transactions a quarter-century old suggests on the surface no immediate threat to the firm's present prosperity. Am I correct in inferring that the significance of this ledger is of a rather different nature?" A long pause fell upon the room. Outside, the November wind pressed lightly against the window glass. When Pembroke spoke again, his carefully modulated voice had dropped somewhat in pitch. "You are entirely correct," said he at last. "The ledger touches upon a period in which the firm made certain investments in South American railway infrastructure. The venture collapsed in 1891. It was a considerable loss, publicly attributed at the time to the negligence of a foreign contractor. There was, I need not tell you, some unhappy publicity. The contractor in question, a man named Vargas, died shortly afterward in impoverished circumstances." He paused. "The ledger records the transactions of that period in their original and unedited form." Holmes said nothing, but I observed the faintest contraction about his eyes, which I had come to recognize as the mark of a conclusion formed. "You will wish to know," Pembroke continued with the air of a man forcing himself forward along a painful path, who had access to the archive in the days preceding the 17th. There were, in addition to myself and Miss Graves, 3 individuals with legitimate reason to be upon our premises. The first is Mr. Horace Bellamy, my junior partner, who joined the firm 14 years ago, and is a man of considerable ambition. The second is Mr. Silas Morton, a former clerk of ours who retired some years since to the country and has lately returned to London. He called upon me on the 15th to discuss a personal matter. And the third is the Reverend Adrian Cole, who serves as trustee to the firm's charitable endowment and visited on the afternoon of the 16th. Holmes had returned to his chair and was regarding the ceiling with an abstracted air. "Tell me, Mr. Pembroke," said he quietly, "are any of these individuals known to you to have had any connection, direct or indirect, with the railway venture of 1889? The question appeared to cause the old banker considerable effort to receive. He straightened in his chair and met Holmes's gaze with eyes that held beneath their pallor something that I can only describe as moral pain. "They are," said he, "each of them, I in one capacity or another." Holmes nodded slowly, as though this answered something he had not yet put into words. "Very well," said he. "I shall look into the matter, Mr. Pembroke. I would ask you to refrain from questioning any of the individuals you have named, and to make no mention of this consultation to anyone within the firm. Watson, I think, will agree with me that a case of this character merits our most careful attention." I assured our visitor that it did, and the arrangements for Holmes's preliminary visit to the firm were speedily concluded. When Pembroke had gone, I turned to find Holmes already at his index, drawing out a worn volume of press cuttings from the years preceding the century. "The South American Railway collapse of 1891, he murmured, more to himself than to me. I recall reading of it at the time. The contractor Vargas, the firm of Pembroke. He paused, a cutting held loosely between his fingers. "Watson," said he, "our client's agitation is the agitation of a man who fears not the loss of money, but the recovery of truth. The ledger has not been stolen by a thief. It has been taken by someone who, like our client himself, has a very particular and personal interest in what those pages contain." He set down the cutting and reached for his pipe. "The question," said he, "is not who wished the ledger destroyed. I fancy several people may have wished that for a great many years. The question is who, at this precise moment, found themselves unable to wait any longer." I had no answer to offer him, and Holmes characteristically required none. He settled back into his chair, in his eyes half closed and his pipe sending slow blue spirals toward the ceiling, already far advanced into that interior world of inference and deduction which it was not given to ordinary men to enter. I took up the newspaper again, but my eyes moved little upon its columns. Outside, the November afternoon was darkening rapidly, and the lamps along Baker Street were beginning their nightly vigil over the wet and gleaming pavement. Chapter 2. Civility Under Strain. The invitation arrived the following morning, written in Pembroke's neat, deliberate hand upon heavy cream notepaper, and addressed to Holmes with a formality that suggested the old banker was more accustomed to directing affairs than to seeking assistance in them. He had arranged a small supper at his residence in Montague Square for the evening of that same day, and had taken the liberty, he wrote, of including among the assembled guests the very individuals of whom he had spoken at Baker Street. He trusted that Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson would consent to attend as friends of his late brother-in-law, a fiction he had already communicated to the others, and which he hoped would serve as sufficient pretext for the occasion. Holmes read the letter twice, folded it along its original creases, and set it beside his breakfast cup with an expression of mild satisfaction. "Pembroke has more resourcefulness than his manner suggests," said he. "To bring the relevant parties together under a social pretext is precisely what I should have recommended. He has saved us a step." "Do you expect to learn a great deal from a single evening supper?" I asked. I expect to learn a great deal more from a single evening supper than from a fortnight of formal interviews," Holmes replied, reaching for the marmalade. "People who are on their guard against a detective are perfectly defenseless against a dinner table." Montague Square received us at 7:30. Pembroke's house was of the solid, well-proportioned kind favoured by prosperous city men of the previous generation. Nothing ostentatious, nothing neglected, every surface polished to a quiet lustre that spoke of old money and older habits. Our host received us in the drawing-room with a warmth that cost him some visible effort to sustain, and made the introductions with the practised ease of a man who had spent a lifetime managing social occasions more complicated than the present. Horace Bellamy was the first to draw my attention. He was perhaps 40, broad in the shoulder, with a full reddish-brown moustache and the rapid, decisive movements of a man who had made his way by energy rather than patience. He shook Holmes's hand firmly, and mine with equal vigour, and at once launched into a cheerful commentary on the fog that had settled over the West End, his voice carrying that particular note of aggressive sociability which sometimes masks a natural wariness. He was, I judged, a man who preferred to control the conversational field. Miss Eleanor Graves occupied a chair near the fire, and I confess she was not quite what I had constructed in my mind from Pembroke's description. I had expected the conventional picture of the efficient secretary. Angular, self-effacing, watchful. In her place I found a composed woman of perhaps 35, with dark eyes set wide in an intelligent face, and a manner of quiet attentiveness that suggested she was accustomed to observing others without herself being particularly observed. She acknowledged our introduction with a brief, composed smile, and I noticed that her gaze lingered upon Holmes for a moment, with an appraisal she did not trouble to conceal. Silas Morton sat somewhat apart from the others near the window, a slight man grown old in a way that seemed less the natural consequence of years than of some more particular diminishment. His hair was quite white and carefully combed, his clothes good, but hanging rather loose upon him, as though acquired in a more substantial period of his life. When Pembroke presented us, Morton rose with a small, stiff bow, and I observed that his right hand, extended briefly for the courtesy of a handshake, trembled with a faint but unmistakable persistence that belonged, I thought, less to simple age than to a nervous constitution under some present strain. The Reverend Adrian Cole was the last to be presented. He was a tall, thin man of 60 or thereabouts, silver-haired and grave, with the benign and slightly remote expression of a clergyman long habituated to the contemplation of human weakness, from a safe professional distance. He greeted us with courtesy and a measured warmth, and at once engaged Holmes in a brief exchange about the architecture of the city churches, which Holmes navigated pleasantly while conveying the impression of a man with no interest in anything beyond the pleasures of good company. We passed to dinner at 8. The table was well appointed, the food excellent. He and Pembroke performed the duties of host with a discipline that I found, under the circumstances, deeply impressive. The conversation moved through the expected channels: the weather, the latest proceedings in Parliament, a recent lecture at the Royal Institution. And to any observer unacquainted with the circumstances, it would have appeared an entirely unremarkable gathering of respectable Londoners. And yet, the strain was there, unmistakable to anyone attending closely to it. It manifested differently in each person, and it was in the observation of these differences that Holmes, I knew, was chiefly occupied throughout the meal, though he appeared to devote himself entirely to his food and to the agreeable flow of dinner-table discourse. It was Bellamy who introduced the subject of the firm's history, and he did so with an energy that seemed, on reflection, rather too deliberate to be entirely natural. He spoke of the firm's recent commissions, its sound present position, and then made a broad, dismissive reference to what he called the misfortunes of the early 90s, assuring the table that such matters were entirely ancient history and, in any case, quite certainly the result of the foreign contractor's incompetence rather than any misjudgment on the firm's part. He said this with great confidence and a slight laugh, and immediately changed the subject to a cricket match. Misfiled, most probably, Bellamy added a moment later, in apparent response to some remark of Pembroke's that I had not quite caught, and I realized with a slight start that the old banker had introduced very quietly the subject of the missing ledger, and Pembroke had done so almost in passing, characterizing it as a domestic inconvenience. But Bellamy's response had been rapid to the point of anticipation, and Holmes, I observed from beneath the most casual of glances, had noted this with the minute register of attention he gave to things that interested him. Miss Graves, for her part, had gone quite still at the mention of the South American venture. The word passed unremarked by the others, but the colour that had been present in her cheeks a moment before had withdrawn entirely, leaving her face composed but bloodless, and she applied herself to her glass of claret with a steadiness that spoke of conscious self-control rather than ease. Morton, when Pembroke addressed him directly on some neutral matter of the city, offered his reply in a voice of elaborate normality, and then settled back into his corner of the table with the relieved expression of a man who has crossed a patch of thin ice without mishap. His fork moved mechanically, but he ate little. It was the Reverend Cole who produced the remark that stayed with me longest after the evening was concluded. It came late in the meal, when the subject of an old acquaintance of Pembroke's was raised, a man who had, apparently, suffered some reversal, and was lately in reduced circumstances. Cole nodded slowly, set down his glass, and said, in the tone of a man offering a considered philosophical position rather than mere table talk, "It is the settled conviction of my experience that old matters are best undisturbed. Time does not precisely heal all wounds, but it does, at the very least, permit the scar to form. To reopen what the years have mercifully covered is, in my view, rarely to the benefit of those concerned." He spoke it to the table in general, but his eyes, in the brief moment before he resumed his customary expression of clerical benignity, were directed at Alastair Pembroke. Holmes said nothing in reply. He took a slow sip of wine and remarked pleasantly that the pheasant was admirably prepared, and the conversation drifted onward. We took our leave shortly after 10. The November night had thickened the fog considerably, and we made our way back toward Baker Street in the damp, muffled quiet of the cab, the street lamps passing like dim orange moons in the murk. Holmes sat with his arms folded and his chin upon his chest for several minutes before he spoke. "Well," I ventured at last, "what do you make of them?" "I make of them," said Holmes with a measured deliberateness, "precisely what I expected. 4 people, each of them acquainted for many years with the same particular secret, each carrying it in the manner most natural to their individual character. Bellamy carries it as a burden he has decided to despise. Miss Graves carries it as a wound. Morton carries it as a terror. And the Reverend Cole carries it as a theology." He turned his face briefly towards the fogged window. "When silence is shared among several people," he continued half to himself, "it ceases to be merely the absence of speech. It becomes a structure, a thing they have built together, and have each, in their own way, agreed to maintain. What interests me, Watson, is not the silence itself. It is the question of why, after so very many years, that structure is at last beginning to crack." Chapter 3. Death in the Archive. The message reached Baker Street at 20 minutes past 8 the following morning, delivered by a boy from the firm's offices, and written in Miss Graves's hand, rather than Pembroke's. That alone told me something was wrong before I had read a single word. Holmes read it over my shoulder in silence, set it upon the breakfast table with the deliberate care of a man suppressing an impulse toward haste, and said simply, "Your bag, Watson, if you please." The note informed us that Mr. Alastair Pembroke had been discovered dead in his private office at 7:30 that morning by Miss Graves herself, who had arrived early to attend to correspondence. The door between the office and the archive room had been standing open. The police had been sent for and were already upon the premises. It was signed with Miss Graves' name and contained, at the very bottom, a single line that she had evidently added as an afterthought, the ink slightly less even than the rest. "There is no sign of how it happened." We were at Threadneedle Street within the half hour. The firm of Pembroke, Bellamy and Associates occupied the upper 2 floors of a narrow but handsome building of Georgian brick, and we mounted to it through a passage that smelled of old timber and banker's dust. The particular atmosphere, half prosperous, half sepulchral, that attaches to institutions which have handled other men's money across several generations. A constable at the stair admitted us upon Holmes's card, and we were met on the landing by Inspector Lestrade, who shook hands with the satisfied expression he reserved for occasions when Holmes's assistance had been sought before his own efforts had been fully exhausted. "Glad you've come, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, drawing us aside from the small cluster of clerks who hovered at a respectful and unnerved distance along the corridor. "Queer business. No sign of any forced entry anywhere in the building. The outer door was locked when the secretary arrived, and she used her own key. The archive room was also locked. Nothing appears to have been disturbed, except for the man himself." He led us into Pembroke's private office. It was a room of sober distinction, lined with law books and bound directories. The desk a wide mahogany affair positioned to command both the entrance door and the window that gave upon a narrow inner courtyard. Pembroke sat, or rather had settled, in the great leather chair behind the desk, his posture that of a man who had leaned back for a moment's rest, and simply not resumed. His face wore no expression of violent shock or pain, only a particular vacancy, the absolute relinquishment of feature that belongs to the newly dead. I made my examination with care. His colour and the slight rigidity of the extremities suggested death had occurred sometime between 10 o'clock the previous evening and 2 in the morning. There was no mark of violence upon the body, no evidence of any external injury. His collar was slightly loosened, his right hand resting open upon the arm of the chair, his left having swept, in what I took to be a final involuntary movement, a small quantity of papers to the floor beside him. His medical history was unknown to me, but the faint bluish cast about his lips and the general presentation left me in little professional doubt. "His heart," I said to Holmes, who had stationed himself not at the body but at the desk, examining its surface with a lens. I would not wish to be definitive without a post-mortem examination, but the presentation is consistent with cardiac failure. A man of his age and evident constitution under considerable stress. "Yes," said Holmes absently, his lens moving in small, precise arcs across the desktop. "Yes, I should think the heart entirely probable. Lestrade, this smear here. What do you make of it?" Lestrade stepped forward and peered at the area Holmes indicated. Along the right-hand edge of the desk's leather surface, barely perceptible against the dark green of the inlay, there ran a faint, elongated mark, even as though a document of some breadth had been drawn swiftly across the surface and then removed. Holmes straightened and moved to the fireplace before Lestrade had formed any reply. In the grate, among the grey residue of what had been a modest coal fire, lay a fragment of paper, partially consumed and curled at its surviving edge by the heat to which it had been exposed. Holmes crouched before the grate and examined it without touching it for nearly a full minute, then produced from his coat pocket the pair of thin steel forceps he habitually carried, lifted the fragment with great delicacy, and held it to the grey morning light from the courtyard window. "A ledger page," he said quietly. "The paper is of the same heavy linen stock as the volumes in that archive. The surviving portion carries 3 columns of figures and a marginal annotation in a hand I have not previously encountered." He set the fragment with careful precision upon the corner of the desk and turned to survey the room. It was at this point that the other parties arrived, having been summoned by Lestrade's constable. They came within minutes of one another, and their several entrances afforded Holmes, standing with apparent idleness beside the window, the opportunity for that concentrated, unobtrusive observation at which he excelled. Bellamy came first. He entered the room with the quick step of a man who has received an unwelcome shock and is determined not to be governed by it, took in the scene at the desk, and immediately drew himself up with an expression of sharp indignation. The indignation, I thought, knew of a man affronted by an event that has disrupted arrangements he had not quite completed. He demanded of Lestrade what had occurred, what was being done, and whether the firm's clients had been notified in rapid succession and with a force that carried conviction. His eyes, however, remained quite dry throughout, and when they passed briefly over the fragment upon the desk, they passed rather too quickly. Miss Graves came next, and I watched her with the particular attention of a physician accustomed to distinguishing the nature as well as the fact of distress. She wept, and did so without any evident effort at suppression, pressing a folded handkerchief against her eyes as she stood at the doorway and looked across at the figure in the chair. The grief was perfectly genuine. Of that I felt satisfied. But beneath it, or perhaps alongside it, there moved something else, something quieter and more complex. I searched for the word as I observed her, and the word that came was relief. Not pleasure, not satisfaction, nothing so coarse as either, but the particular release of feature that belongs to one from whom a long-anticipated blow has at last fallen, and is now, whatever its pain, at least no longer to be feared. Morton arrived shortly after, offering apologies for his lateness, in a voice that was, he assured us, the consequence of an indisposition during the night. He had not slept well. He had experienced some difficulty with his digestion. The details of the ailment shifted slightly as he repeated them, and when Holmes asked, with an air of sympathetic curiosity entirely unlike his usual manner, though whether Morton had had occasion to leave his lodgings at any point during the night, the old man's hands performed an involuntary tightening about the brim of the hat he held before him, and he replied, after a pause just perceptibly too long, that he had not. Lestrade, surveying the assembled company with the confident expression of a man who believes himself to have a manageable list of possibilities, drew Holmes aside near the door, and murmured that, in his experience, such affairs most commonly resolve to inheritance, professional rivalry, or some entanglement of a romantic character, and that the junior partner's rather conspicuous composure struck him as suggestive. Holmes listened to this with every appearance of respect. "It is a perfectly reasonable hypothesis," he told Lestrade, with a courtesy that I had learned to regard as its own variety of caution. "I should be grateful, however, if you would preserve that fragment from the grate with the greatest possible care, and ensure that no one enters the archive room until I have had the opportunity to examine it thoroughly." Later, descending to the street in the raw morning air, I asked Holmes what he had concluded. "Concluded?" He turned up the collar of his coat against the cold. "It is far too early for conclusions, Watson. But I have observed 3 things that Lestrade has not, and one of them concerns the timing of that fire." He paused at the edge of the pavement, his breath misting briefly in the grey air. "The fragment in that grate was burned before Pembroke died. The ash distribution and the degree of cooling make that entirely plain, which means that whoever fed that page to the flames did not do so in panic after finding a dead man. They did so in the presence of a living one." He raised his stick for a cab and said nothing further until we reached Baker Street. Chapter 4. Ink that Speaks. Holmes did not sleep that night, or if he did, no evidence of it was apparent when I came down to breakfast the following morning to find him already at the table he had cleared and converted into a makeshift laboratory. The charred fragment from Pembroke's grate had been transferred to a sheet of white card and placed beneath his lens, flanked by 2 small glass dishes and a row of chemical reagents arranged with the neat economy of a man who knows precisely what he intends to do with them. His dressing gown was on, his pipe cold and forgotten at his elbow. Then he had the concentrated stillness of a craftsman entirely absorbed in his material. I poured my coffee and sat at the far end of the table, understanding from long experience that inquiry would be unwelcome until he chose to speak. The morning light fell grey and level across the room, and the only sound for some minutes was the faint scratch of Holmes's pen as he made notes upon a separate sheet in the small, rapid hand he employed when recording observations he did not yet wish to arrange into argument. "The ink," he said at last, without raising his head, "is the most instructive element. I had suspected as much from the first examination, and the chemistry confirms it entirely. I moved my chair closer. The surviving portion of the ledger page was perhaps 4 inches in width and 3 in height. Its lower and left edges consumed to an irregular fringe of carbon, its upper right corner relatively intact. The surviving text comprised, as Holmes had noted at Threadneedle Street, 3 columns of figures and a marginal annotation. The figures themselves were written in a consistent hand, closely spaced and precise. The annotation was in a different hand, smaller, more hurried, its letters forming with the slight rightward compression of someone writing under constraint of time or agitation. 2 distinct hands, I observed. 3, Holmes corrected, setting down his pen and taking up the lens again. The column entries are in 1 hand. Morton's, as I will demonstrate shortly. The marginal annotation is in a second. And here, beneath the annotation, are visible only under this particular angle of illumination, and confirmed by the sulfide reagent I applied an hour ago, is a 3rd set of figures, erased before the annotation was added, and partially recovered by the chemistry. He tilted the card with great care towards the window light, and I leaned forward. He was right. Beneath the visible annotation, faint as a watermark and following the same ruled lines as the columns above, a ghost of numerals was just discernible. Not identical to the figures above them, but related to them as a corrected account is related to an original error. The figures as written, said Holmes, record the disbursement of a sum of £11,400 to a contractor identified only by the initials VR, which we may take, given the context, did to refer to Vargas or to some intermediary firm operating under a similar designation. The recovered figures beneath show the original entry, which recorded a disbursement of £7,200 to the same party. The difference, £4,200, was added subsequently by the same pen but with an ink of measurably younger age. I can distinguish this because older iron gall ink, when treated with the appropriate reagent, produces a richer, darker response than ink applied to the same page at a later date. The addition was made after the original entry, perhaps by some months. I considered this in silence for a moment. So, the sum paid to Vargas was artificially inflated in the ledger. Inflated after the fact and recorded as the original figure. Yes, which means that £4,200 were drawn from the firm's accounts ostensibly as payment to the contractor, but the contractor received only the smaller sum. The difference went elsewhere. Holmes set down the lens and sat back, pressing his fingertips together. Now, the annotation in the second hand. It is a brief one, only a partial line survives the burning, and it reads, in what remains, Syndicate confirmed, P.M., and, at which point the page is consumed. P and M we may confidently assign to Pembroke and Morton. The third name is lost. The silent partner you mentioned. The silent partner I inferred from Pembroke's manner, and now find confirmed by physical evidence. A third individual participated in whatever arrangement was reached regarding the disposition of that £4,000. His name has been burned away, whether by accident or by design, I cannot yet say. Holmes reached for his pipe, found it cold and set it aside again. I spent part of the night with the newspaper indices for 1891. The collapse of the South American venture was reported in the financial press, with a uniform emphasis on the contractor's failure. Vargas was named, his firm's inadequacies were catalogued, and the matter was thereafter dropped. There was no inquiry, no legal proceeding, and no dissenting voice. A collapse of that magnitude attracting so little official scrutiny is itself a document of sorts. He rose from the table and went to the window, where he stood for a moment looking down at the street. It had begun to rain, a thin, persistent November rain that darkened the pavements and sent the pedestrians below into their collars. "I questioned each of the 4 yesterday evening," he said, individually and briefly, on the pretext of clarifying Pembroke's movements in his final days. I asked each of them, at some point in the conversation, whether they had been acquainted with the South American venture during the period of its operation. And their responses. That is precisely what interests me. Each of them admitted to some knowledge of the affair, but in terms so uniformly guarded, so similarly constructed, that the phrasing itself becomes evidence. Bellamy said it was a matter concluded well before his time with the firm, and in any case fully accounted for in the public record. Miss Graves said she had encountered references to it in the course of her archival duties, but of course had no direct involvement. Morton said he recalled the period as a difficult one for the firm, naturally, but could add nothing to what was already known. The Reverend Cole said simply that he had heard mention of it, as one hears mention of many things, without retaining any particular impression. Holmes turned from the window. 4 people, 4 answers, 1 template. They have not conspired to produce identical language. That would be too obvious and too fragile. What they have done is something subtler. Over many years, each of them has rehearsed their individual version of the same fundamental evasion until it has become as natural to them as honest speech. The consistency is not collusion. It is long practice. I had followed this with close attention, and one question had been pressing upon me since the previous day. "Holmes," I said, "you told Lestrade that the fragment was burned before Pembroke died. If the burning was done in his presence by someone who came to the office that evening, then we are not dealing with a theft and a coincidental death. We are dealing with a confrontation." "We are dealing with a confrontation," Holmes agreed, with a gravity that was not theatrical, but entirely sincere. Whether that confrontation was the direct cause of Pembroke's death, or only its occasion, is a distinction the post-mortem will illuminate. But the essential fact is this. Someone entered Pembroke's office that evening, burned at least 1 page from the missing ledger in his fireplace, and left him there, alive or already dying, without raising any alarm. He paused. They used the archive key, which was held by Pembroke and Miss Graves, or they were admitted by Pembroke himself, which suggests an individual whose arrival he was either expecting or at least would not have found alarming. "That latter condition," I said slowly, "applies to all 4 of them." "It does," said Holmes, "which is why the fragment itself must tell us what the persons concerned will not." He returned to the table and took up his lens once more, bending over the scorched slip of card with renewed attention. "There is one further element I have not yet mentioned. The marginal annotation in that second and unidentified hand. The ink age places it between the original entries and the altered figures. It was added neither first nor last. It was added in the middle of whatever process produced this page, which means the annotator was present at an intermediate stage of the falsification. Not an architect of it, perhaps, but a witness close enough to record their own part in it. He said nothing further for some minutes. I finished my coffee and watched him work, the rain continuing its quiet industry against the window glass, the fire burning low and steady in the grate. It was only as I rose to take my leave that Holmes spoke again, and he did so without looking up from the fragment, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man speaking less to his companion than to the problem itself. "The third name, Watson," he murmured. "The third name is everything." Chapter 5. The Railway Disaster Revisited. Holmes spent the greater part of the next 2 days in pursuits which he did not immediately share with me, and which I had learned, when across our long association, not to press him upon before he was ready. I knew the signs well enough, the successive mornings on which I called at Baker Street to find him absent, the brief notes he sent round to my practice in lieu of explanation, the particular quality of distraction with which he received me when I did find him in. His mind evidently elsewhere while his pipe burned, and his index volumes lay open about him in the organised disarray of serious research. He was assembling something, piece by careful piece, in the way a watchmaker assembles a mechanism, not displaying each component as he fitted it, but reserving judgment until the whole would either run or it would not. On the third morning following our examination of the fragment, I arrived at Baker Street to find Holmes at his desk with a collection of materials spread before him that told their own story clearly enough. There were several columns of newspaper cuttings, the oldest yellowed to the colour of old bone, arranged in chronological order. There were 2 pages of his own close-written notes. There was a letter on official paper bearing the crest of a firm of city solicitors, and beside it, partially unfolded, what appeared to be a company prospectus of considerable age, its cover page bearing the legend South Atlantic Railway Development Corporation in the florid typeface of the previous decade. "Sit down, Watson," said Holmes without preamble. "I have something to show you, and I shall find it easier to explain in sequence." I sat, and he began. The public record of the South Atlantic Railway venture is, on its surface, perfectly consistent. A development corporation was established in 1887 to finance the construction of a railway line through a mountainous region of northern Argentina. The projected returns were substantial. The promoters argued with some plausibility that the line would open rich interior territories to the Atlantic ports. Capital was raised from several private sources, of which the firm of Pembroke and Associates was among the more significant, having contributed in the region of £30,000 across 3 years. In 1891, following the failure of the construction company operating under the management of one Eduardo Vargas, the venture collapsed. Vargas was cited in the financial press as having grossly mismanaged the construction contracts, falsified progress reports to investors, and ultimately absconded with a portion of the residual funds. He died the following year in Montevideo, in circumstances described as impoverished. Holmes paused and tapped one of the cuttings before him. That is the public record. Now consider several details which the public record either omits or arranges in a particular light. The first is this prospectus. He turned it toward me. The South Atlantic Railway Development Corporation was registered in London in the spring of 1887. Among its listed directors, concealed somewhat by the corporate structure, but recoverable from the original Companies Register filing, which I obtained yesterday through the courtesy of a contact at Somerset House, were 3 individuals identified as executive trustees: Alistair Pembroke or Silas Morton, then a senior clerk rather than a partner, and a third name, one Edmund Cole. I set down my coffee cup. Cole, the Reverend's brother. The Reverend Adrian Cole's younger brother. Edmund Cole was, by the accounts I've gathered, a man of some commercial energy and rather less commercial judgment. He was the effective promoter of the railway scheme. The man who identified the opportunity, Holmes folded his hands upon the desk. When the venture failed, Edmund Cole did not merely lose his investment. He lost everything. The combination of his personal liability and the reputational damage of association with Vargas's fraud left him destitute. He died in 1895, only this past spring. Having spent the intervening 4 years in considerable poverty, his name quietly avoided in city circles. His brother the only family connection who maintained any contact with him. The room was very still. The fire shifted and settled. I found that I was turning over the implications of what Holmes had said and finding each turn of the thought darker than the last. Then the falsification of the ledger entries, I said carefully, was not merely to conceal a financial loss. It was to ensure that the blame for the venture's failure fell upon Vargas, and through association upon Edmund Cole, and away from Pembroke and Morton. Precisely, and the inflated payment to Vargas in the ledger, when compared against the actual sums Vargas received, created the appearance that he had siphoned funds from the corporation. In reality, the discrepancy represented money redirected within the firm to cover losses that had originated, at least in part, from decisions in which Pembroke and Morton were participants rather than victims. Vargas was not innocent. He had his own irregularities which made him a convenient and not entirely undeserving scapegoat. But the full picture was considerably more complicated than the one presented to the press and to the investors. And Edmund Cole? Edmund Cole, as the venture's promoter and an executive trustee, bore the public association with Vargas's failure far more directly than Pembroke, whose firm's role was characterized thereafter as that of a deceived investor. The altered ledger supported that characterization. Without it, the firm's internal records would have shown a rather more active and less innocent involvement. Holmes rose and moved to the window in his characteristic manner, hands clasped behind him. There is one further element. The annotation on the burned fragment, in the second and unidentified hand. I believe it to be Edmund Cole's. The handwriting is not Morton's and not Pembroke's, and the phrasing of the partial text confirming the syndicate's internal arrangement is consistent with the language of a man recording an agreement he has been persuaded to enter rather than one he has designed. He recorded his own participation. He recorded it, and the record was kept in the firm's archive for over 20 years. Perhaps Pembroke retained it as insurance against Morton. Perhaps Morton retained it against Pembroke. Holmes turned from the window. What is clear is that the ledger, in its complete form, would have told this entire story, and that someone, this autumn, determined that the story must not be told. What precipitated it? I asked. Edmund Cole is dead. The venture is ancient history. Why now? Holmes returned to the desk and lifted the solicitor's letter I had noticed on my arrival. Because Pembroke had recently instructed his solicitors to prepare a statement Not a legal instrument, a private document, intended for no particular addressee, setting out what he described to his solicitor as a correction of the record in a matter of long standing. The solicitor, a cautious man named Fairweather, whom I visited yesterday, was not privy to its contents, but he confirmed that Pembroke had been working toward it for several months, and that his health had been declining, and his mind had been running upon old affairs with increasing frequency. Holmes set the letter down. The Reverend Cole knew his brother had died in the shadow of a false account. He had known it for years. What changed this autumn was that Pembroke, facing his own mortality, had begun to consider whether his silence should outlast him. I absorbed this in silence for a moment. So one of them, Morton, Cole, perhaps Bellamy if he knew more than he has admitted, discovered that Pembroke intended to speak. Or Pembroke told them himself. He was, I think, a man who had reached the age at which confession becomes less a spiritual exercise than a physiological necessity. The weight of it had become too great for the years remaining to him. Holmes's voice held no particular emotion as he said it, but there was, in his expression, something that I can only describe as sombre respect. The acknowledgement of a human predicament beyond the reach of either criticism or remedy. He gathered the cuttings into a neat pile and set them aside with the air of a man who has completed one stage of a journey and is calculating the distance to the next. The fragment gives us the mechanism of the fraud, he said. The company's register gives us the third name. What remains is to determine which of those present in that building on the evening of Pembroke's death carried the ledger out of the archive, burned that page in the grate, and left an old man to whatever Providence and his own failing heart decreed. He reached for his pipe and this time filled and lit it, the small ritual of deliberate thought. "Tomorrow," he said through the first blue drift of smoke, "I think it is time to speak more directly to each of them, not as a dinner guest, not as an interested observer. The moment for indirection has passed." Chapter 6. Shared Guilt. The interviews Holmes conducted the following day were unlike anything I had previously observed in his methods, and I had, by November of 1895, observed a considerable variety of them. There was no theatrical confrontation, no sudden revelation deployed to unsettle a witness before they had recovered their composure. Instead, Holmes moved through the 4 conversations with the patience and quietness of a surveyor, marking the true boundaries of a property long disputed, each exchange designed not to produce a confession, but to establish the precise dimensions of what each person knew, had known, and had chosen to carry in silence. He had arranged to see them separately at intervals of an hour at the firm's offices, which Bellamy had reopened for business 2 days after Pembroke's death, with a briskness that was entirely in character. I accompanied Holmes throughout and recorded what I could. And though the most significant elements of each exchange were often not in the words spoken, but in the quality of the silence that preceded or followed them. Miss Graves received us first, in her small adjoining office where the filing cabinets stood in their orderly rows, and the desk was bare of everything except the work immediately in hand. She had recovered the outward composure of a capable woman attending to necessary things, but there were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of nights not well spent. And when Holmes settled into the chair across from her and asked without any preliminary Whether she had been aware of discrepancies in the 1889 accounts before the ledger's disappearance, the hands she had folded upon the desk tightened fractionally before she replied. "I discovered them in September," she said. "I had been reorganizing the archive as part of a general review Mr. Pembroke requested. He told me at the time that the review was for the purposes of the firm's centennial record, which is to be published next year. I found the ledger in the ordinary course of that work, and noticed, as anyone with a familiarity with double-entry bookkeeping would have noticed, that the disbursement figures for the South Atlantic account did not reconcile with certain corresponding entries in the payment journal of the same period." "You brought this to Mr. Pembroke's attention," said Holmes. It was not a question. A pause of several seconds. "I did, in October. He listened to what I had found and was very still for a long time. Then he thanked me and asked me to leave the ledger with him and to say nothing of the matter to anyone." She looked at Holmes directly. "He did not deny that the figures were wrong. He did not offer any explanation for the discrepancy. He simply said that it was an old matter and that he would attend to it." "And you formed your own conclusion about the nature of the discrepancy?" "I formed a conclusion, yes." Her voice was even, the voice of a woman who has spent years being precise in the service of institutions that were not always precise themselves. "I have worked in financial administration for 15 years, Mr. Holmes. I know the difference between an arithmetic error and an arithmetic alteration. The entries had been changed deliberately by someone with access to the ledger after the original figures were set down. The paper told me that much without any instruction." Holmes nodded slowly. "You were not then surprised when the ledger disappeared?" Something moved in her expression. Not evasion, but a more complicated honesty. "I was frightened," she said quietly. "Not surprised, frightened." Holmes thanked her and did not press further. Morton was waiting in the corridor when we emerged, having arrived, as Holmes had intended, slightly before his appointed time. He was more diminished than he had appeared at Pembroke's supper. The collar of his coat turned up as though against a cold that was not entirely meteorological, his white hair less carefully arranged, the tremor in his hands somewhat more pronounced. Holmes settled him in Pembroke's own office, which produced in the old man a visible discomfort he was at some effort to conceal, and began by asking him, in a tone of almost gentle conversationality, how long he had known the Reverend Cole. The question caught Morton off his prepared ground. "The Reverend," he said. 20 years, perhaps, 25. He was introduced to the firm through Mr. Pembroke. "And his brother, Edmund Cole?" A longer pause. Morton examined his hat with great attention. "I knew Edmund Cole during the period of the South American enterprise. We were not close acquaintances." "But you were co-trustees of the Development Corporation." "In a formal capacity only." Morton's voice had taken on the careful, rehearsed quality that Holmes had described to me as the sound of long practice. "My role was administrative rather than strategic." "You kept the accounts," said Holmes pleasantly. "I kept certain records." Yes." "Including the records of the disbursements to the Vargas contracting firm, which you entered at figures somewhat in excess of the actual sums paid." The silence that followed this was of a different order than those preceding it. Morton looked up from his hat and met Holmes's gaze, and for a moment the careful architecture of the old man's defence was visible as a structure rather than a substance, the armature showing through. Then he looked away again. "Mr. Pembroke instructed me," he said very quietly. I was a junior clerk in an extremely subordinate position. I was told that it was necessary for the reconciliation of the accounts and that the discrepancy would be adjusted in subsequent quarters. It was not adjusted, and I was not in a position to insist upon it. Did Edmund Cole know what had been done to the accounts? Morton's reply came after a pause so long that the clock on the mantelpiece, which I had not previously noticed, became audible in the interim. Not immediately, he said. He discovered it. I believe in 1892, after the collapse, he came to Pembroke. I was not present at that meeting, but I know that he was told that any public statement he made would be interpreted as the self-serving complaint of the man most publicly associated with Vargas's failure, and that the firm's solicitors were prepared to act accordingly. His voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur. He had nothing left to fight with. He went away. Holmes rose. Thank you, Mr. Morton. I would ask you to remain in London and available to me for the next several days. The Reverend Cole came last. He entered the room with the composed dignity of a man who has long since made his peace with certain things, or at least achieved a working arrangement with them, and accepted the chair Holmes offered with a brief, measured inclination of his head. He was, I thought, in some ways the most difficult of the four to read. Not because he was the most guarded, but because his guardedness was of the most practised and settled kind, the product not of recent anxiety, but of decades of accommodation. Holmes did not approach the substance indirectly with Cole. He laid the established facts before him with the conciseness of a legal summary. The company's register entry, Edmund Cole's role as promoter, the altered accounts, the Mortons' admission of that morning, and waited. The Reverend listened without interruption and without any significant alteration of expression. When Holmes had finished, he said, "You are entirely correct in your account of the facts as they were." "You knew," said Holmes. "I knew from Edmund himself. He came to me after his meeting with Pembroke. I was, as you perhaps appreciate, in an impossible position. My brother had participated, however passively and however deceived, in a commercial arrangement that did not withstand scrutiny. To speak publicly in his defence was to bring greater scrutiny upon him, not less." He paused. "I made a choice that I have had occasion to reconsider many times since. I chose silence, and I watched my brother spend his last years in the shadow of a reputation he did not entirely deserve. And when Pembroke told you, this autumn, that he intended to make a corrective statement." The Reverend's composed expression shifted very slightly towards something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but inhabited the uncertain territory between the two. "He told me in September," he said. "He told me he felt it was owed to Edmund's memory, and that he had not long enough remaining to himself to permit further delay. I told him I thought it an admirable resolution." He looked at Holmes steadily. "I meant it, Mr. Holmes. Whatever comfort his silence had provided me across the years, I had long ceased to believe it a justifiable one." Holmes and I walked back to Baker Street that afternoon through the early dusk, the streets already lamplit and the air carrying the particular sharpness of a London November, pressing towards evening. I had been turning the morning's conversations over throughout the walk, and it was only as we reached our own door that I gave voice to what had been forming gradually into a conclusion. The guilt, I said, was shared in very unequal proportions. Pembroke and Morton built the falsification. Cole simply failed to dismantle it, and Miss Graves stumbled upon it entirely by accident. "Precisely," said Holmes, pushing open the door. "4 people inside a single secret, and not one of them occupied the same moral position within it. That is, Watson, how such arrangements endure. Not through solidarity, but through the impossibility of any one party disentangling themselves without implicating the rest." He began to climb the stair. The ledger was the thread that held the knot together, and now it is gone, and someone has pulled it. He said nothing further until we were upstairs and the fire had been replenished, and then he sat for a long while without speaking, his eyes upon the ceiling and his fingers laced beneath his chin, in the attitude of a man who has gathered all his material and is preparing, at last, to build. Chapter 7. The Convenient Heir. It was Lestrade who brought the matter to a provisional head, as Lestrade had a tendency to do, arriving at the correct destination by a road that was not always the most direct, and with a confidence in his own navigation that occasionally served justice well enough in the outcome, if not invariably in the reasoning. He appeared at Baker Street on the morning of the 23rd, 2 days after our interviews at the firm, with the air of a man who has assembled a satisfactory case and wishes to share the satisfaction before it has been subjected to any inconvenient scrutiny. Holmes received him in his dressing gown, with the barely perceptible patience of a man who has heard the conclusion before. "The premises have been stated." I set down my pen. I had been writing up the previous day's notes, and gave Lestrade my full attention, which was the attention he invariably preferred. "Mr. Holmes," said the inspector, settling himself into the basket chair with the ease of long familiarity, "I believe we have our man in the Pembroke affair, and I thought it only proper to inform you before the matter proceeds further." "Bellamy," said Holmes without inflection. Lestrade's satisfaction suffered a momentary check, in the way that a man's enjoyment of a view is somewhat reduced by discovering that another has already been standing there for some time. "You anticipated me," he said. "The evidence points in that direction with sufficient clarity to be noticed at some distance," Holmes replied, not unkindly. "Pray set out what you have found." Lestrade produced his notebook with the ceremonial care he reserved for cases of which he was especially proud. First, the matter of succession, under the terms of the partnership agreement and confirmed by Pembroke's solicitors, Mr. Horace Bellamy inherits full controlling interest in the firm upon Pembroke's death. He becomes in effect sole principal. A firm of that standing and established client base represents a very considerable asset. The motive is not difficult to establish. "It is not," Holmes agreed. Second, the archive cabinet. Our fingerprint man examined the cabinet thoroughly on the day after Pembroke's death. Bellamy's prints are present on the upper left handle and on the inner frame of the door, in positions consistent with someone having opened the cabinet and reached for the contents of the uppermost shelf, precisely where the missing ledger stood. Holmes nodded, his expression giving nothing away. Third, the question of the disagreement with Miss Graves. She was reluctant to speak of it, but pressed, and she acknowledged that Bellamy had approached her in October. The same month, you will note, that Pembroke had spoken to her regarding the ledger discrepancies, and had asked her, with some urgency, whether she had found anything unusual in the course of her archival review. She told him she had found nothing of consequence. He apparently accepted this, but she described his manner as unusually insistent and his interest in the archive as something she had not previously observed in him. Lestrade closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Taken together, I am satisfied that Bellamy became aware of Pembroke's intention to expose the firm's past irregularities, recognized the threat to his own inheritance and professional standing, and acted accordingly. I intend to put these points to him formally this afternoon. There was a brief silence. Holmes had risen during Lestrade's recital and drifted, as if without particular purpose, to the mantelpiece, where he stood with one arm resting along the shelf, his chin slightly lowered and his eyes moving with a slow, considering cast over the middle distance. He remained in this attitude for perhaps half a minute before he turned. "The evidence you have described," he said, "is entirely real. I would not dispute a single element of it. Bellamy's prints are on the cabinet, his succession is established, and his conversation with Miss Graves demonstrates an awareness of the archive's significance that he has not volunteered. All of this is true," he paused, "and none of it is sufficient." Lestrade's expression shifted into the watchful, a slightly defensive attention he adopted when he suspected Holmes was about to dismantle something he had spent effort constructing. "I should be glad to hear your objection," he said with careful neutrality. "My objection is not to the facts, but to the character of the man as evidenced by his behaviour since Pembroke's death," Holmes said. "You will recall Bellamy's demeanour when we arrived at the firm on the morning Pembroke was discovered. I observed him with some care. His indignation was immediate, forceful, and entirely authentic. The genuine anger of a man confronted with an event that has disrupted his expectations and affronted his sense of order. That quality of spontaneous, impulsive reaction is not the behaviour of a man who has planned and executed a course of action and is now performing surprise for an audience. A calculated man prepares his response. Bellamy had not prepared his, he had simply responded. A man can be both impulsive and criminal, Lestrade observed. He can, but consider the action itself. The removal of the ledger, the burning of a selected page, the careful restoration of apparent order. These are the acts of someone who had thought the matter through with considerable deliberation over a period of time. They require patience and foresight. Bellamy's prints on the cabinet are consistent with a man who has handled the cabinet in the ordinary course of his duties as a partner in the firm for 14 years. His conversation with Miss Graves demonstrates curiosity, even anxiety. But curiosity and anxiety are not conspiracy. Holmes returned to his chair and sat. I am not telling you that Bellamy is innocent of all possible association with these events. I am telling you that he did not take the ledger, and that if you charge him on the present evidence you will find, upon closer examination, that the timeline makes it very difficult to sustain. Lestrade frowned. The timeline. The page in the grate was burned before Pembroke's death. I established that from the physical evidence of the fragment itself, the ash distribution, the cooling pattern, the stage of combustion relative to the condition of the room, and the residual warmth of the coal. The burning took place during an encounter on the evening of Pembroke's death in the old man's presence. Bellamy's movements that evening are, I have established, accounted for until shortly before 11 o'clock. The medical evidence places the probable time of Pembroke's death between 10 and 2. The window is narrow, and Bellamy's alibi for the earlier part of it is credible. He paused, drawing once upon his pipe. More significantly, The man who burned that page in Pembroke's fireplace is the man who had the most urgent personal reason to prevent the ledger's contents from surviving. Not the man who stood to inherit a prosperous firm, but the man who stood to be destroyed by the truth the firm's own records would confirm. Lestrade was quiet for a moment, working through the implications with the methodical fairness that was, beneath his professional vanity, his most genuine quality. "You are pointing toward Morton," he said. "I am pointing toward the evidence," Holmes replied, "and toward where it leads when followed without preference for the most obvious destination." He set down his pipe. "I would ask you, Lestrade, to hold your hand for 48 hours. I have one further inquiry to pursue, and if it confirms what I expect it to confirm, you will have considerably more to act upon than fingerprints on a cabinet handle." Lestrade deliberated, then gave a short nod. He was, to his credit, a man who could revise his position when presented with argument of sufficient weight, provided the argument was delivered without condescension. A condition Holmes did not invariably meet, but managed on this occasion with reasonable grace. After Lestrade had gone, I remained in my chair and turned the matter over in the comfortable warmth of the Baker Street sitting room. Holmes had relit his pipe and was studying the ceiling with the abstracted intensity I associated with the concluding stages of an investigation. That period when all the gathered material is subjected to a final, comprehensive review before the resolution is drawn and stated aloud. "Holmes," I said at length, "what is the further inquiry you mentioned to Lestrade?" He lowered his gaze from the ceiling and looked at me with a brief, precise directness. "Morton's movements on the evening of the 17th, he said. "He told us he was unwell and did not leave his lodgings. His lodgings are in Bloomsbury. I have already spoken with his landlady, who proves to be a close and attentive observer of her tenants' habits, as landladies of a certain type invariably are." He drew upon his pipe and released the smoke in a slow or thoughtful stream. "She tells me that Morton went out at 8:30 that evening and did not return until nearly midnight, that he was in a state of considerable agitation upon his return, and asked her, which he had never previously done, for a glass of brandy." He said nothing further, and I did not press him. Outside, the late afternoon had drawn the last of the grey light from the sky, and the street lamps were asserting themselves against the dusk. The fire settled in the grate with a small, domestic sound, and Holmes sat on in the stillness, his pipe going cold again at his elbow, his expression that of a man who has nearly reached the end of a long road and is measuring, with deliberate care, the precise distance that remains. Chapter 8. A False Revelation. Holmes sent 4 notes that evening. 1 to Lestrade, 1 to Bellamy, 1 to Miss Graves, and 1 to Morton, requesting their attendance at the firm's offices the following morning at 11 o'clock. The Reverend Cole received his note by separate hand a few hours later, framed with slightly different language, and dispatched, so Holmes mentioned, only after he had returned from an excursion he did not describe, and I did not inquire into. The 5th note was the one I thought about longest, because Holmes wrote it last, with a particular deliberateness, and sealed it himself rather than leaving it for Mrs. Hudson. I arrived at Baker Street the following morning at 9:30 to find Holmes already dressed, standing at the window with his hands in his pockets and an expression of settled, a forward-looking calm that I had come to associate with occasions when he had resolved all the internal architecture of a case and was waiting only for the external occasion in which to demonstrate it. He turned when I entered, nodded once in the way that served him for a greeting when his mind was elsewhere, and said, without preamble, "There is one step remaining before the assembly this morning, Watson, and I require your assistance with it." He led me down to the street and hailed a cab. We went east into the city and drew up not at Threadneedle Street, but at a smaller building some 3 streets distant, where a firm of inquiry agents known to Holmes conducted their business from a set of rooms above a stationer's shop. Holmes was inside for less than 20 minutes. When he emerged, he was carrying, with careful deliberateness, in a slim volume bound in green Morocco leather. I stared at it. "That is not—" "It is a bookbinder's copy," said Holmes, handing it to me as we settled back into the cab. Competently executed on short notice by a man whose professional discretion I have had cause to test before and found reliable. The binding is precise, the dimensions correct, the tooling adequate to pass inspection under all but the closest scrutiny. He paused. It need only pass a particular variety of scrutiny, not the scrutiny of a scholar, but the scrutiny of a frightened person. Those are entirely different instruments of examination, and the latter is considerably less reliable. He said nothing more on the subject during the short journey to Threadneedle Street. I held the false ledger on my knee and studied it with the mild unsettlement of a man who understands the mechanism of a trap well enough to hope he is not standing in it. The firm's outer office had been arranged, at Holmes's advance request, to accommodate the assembled party in Pembroke's private room. The same room in which the old banker had been discovered 4 days earlier. It was a choice Holmes had made with deliberate intention, I thought, and the effect upon the room's atmosphere was not negligible. The leather chair behind the desk stood empty. The grate, cleaned of its residue, held a fresh but unlighted fire. The archive door to the left was closed. They arrived within minutes of one another. Bellamy came with the vigour of a man determined to assert his new authority over the premises, nodded to Holmes with the wary respect of someone who has been told that the detective has not accepted his guilt and is not yet certain whether this is fortunate or not. Miss Graves took a chair near the window and folded her hands in her lap with the composed attentiveness of a woman prepared for a difficult proceeding. Morton entered last, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man managing a physical fragility that was not entirely physical, and settled into the chair nearest the door, with the unconscious positioning of someone who has been thinking about exits. The Reverend Cole stood rather than sat near the empty mantelpiece, his tall figure very still, his expression the clerical one of practised detachment. Lestrade had positioned himself near the door to the corridor, his notebook open and his pencil ready, whilst with the alert patience of a man who has been persuaded to wait and is not entirely comfortable doing so. Holmes stood at the centre of the room, the green volume held at his side in his left hand. He allowed the initial settling of the company to complete itself before he spoke, and when he did, his voice had the particular quality, measured even carrying easily across the room, that he reserved for occasions when every word was intended to perform a specific function. "I have asked you here this morning," he said, "because a matter that has caused the death of one man and the suffering of several others has reached the point at which it can be examined directly. I shall be brief, because the facts, once arranged in their correct order, are not complicated. But before I set them out, I should tell you that the volume I am holding is a duplicate of the ledger that was removed from this archive on the 17th of November. He raised the green volume slightly as he said it, not theatrically, but with the calm precision of a man producing a document in evidence. The effect upon the room was immediate and differentiated, and I watched it with the attention Holmes had, over years, taught me to apply to such moments. Bellamy looked at the book with the frank curiosity of a man encountering a surprise he has no particular reason to dread. Miss Graves drew a slow breath and held it, her eyes steady upon the volume with an expression that contained, I thought, a measure of relief. The Reverend Cole's composure did not fracture, but there was a slight, involuntary adjustment of his posture, a drawing together, and as of someone bracing against an expected blow, that he controlled within a second and that I would not have caught had I not been attending precisely to him. Morton went pale. It was not a gradual change, not the slow draining of colour that accompanies a sustained realization. It was the rapid, comprehensive pallor of a man upon whose nervous system a specific shock has been delivered. The pallor of someone who has been told that the thing he believed destroyed still exists, that his action has been insufficient, that the ground on which he had briefly and precariously rested his weight has given way beneath him. His hands, which had been resting on his knees, became very still. Holmes observed all of this, as I knew he was observing it, without any visible acknowledgement. He set the volume down upon the desk with great care and moved to the fireplace. Here he crouched in a manner that recalled, with notable precision, his examination of the original fragment and indicated the cleaned grate with a brief, pointing gesture. "The page burned in this grate," he said, "was burned at some point during the evening of the 17th, before Mr. Pembroke's death. I have established this from the physical characteristics of the fragment itself, which I examined at some length, and whose evidence is unambiguous." He rose. The timing is significant because it changes the nature of the event that took place in this room that evening. The burning was not a panicked concealment performed in the aftermath of a death. It was an act performed in the presence of a living man. A man who was apparently engaged in a conversation of considerable intensity. Lestrade was writing. Bellamy had gone very quiet, the earlier vigour entirely suspended. Miss Graves's gaze had moved from the green volume to Holmes, with a focused, unblinking attention. Morton had not moved at all. "I said the volume is a duplicate," Holmes continued, turning to survey the assembled company with the unhurried directness of a man reading from a prepared text. "What I have not yet said is that the original has been located." He paused, and in the pause the silence of the room became its own kind of statement. It was not destroyed. A portion of it was burned here on the night of the 17th, before the remainder was removed from the archive. The remainder still exists. Or its contents are intact. This was not true, as I was well aware, having been present when the false ledger was collected from the bookbinder that morning. But it was said with the absolute assurance of established fact, and the distinction between assertion and truth was available only to Holmes and to me. Morton's composure, which had survived the initial shock of the false ledger's production, did not survive this second statement. He raised his head and looked at Holmes with eyes that held, in the space of a single, unguarded moment, everything that the weeks of careful evasion had been constructed to conceal. the weight of it, the long duration of it, and beneath both, the unmistakable relief of a man for whom endurance has become, finally, impossible. "Then you know," said Morton. His voice was very quiet and entirely steady, and it had lost entirely the elaborate normality he had been sustaining since the morning we first met him. "I know," said Holmes with equal quietness, "but I should like to hear it from you, Mr. Morton, if you are willing. Not for the purpose of producing further evidence. I have, I think, sufficient. But because the man who died in this room 4 days ago deserves that the truth of what happened that evening should be stated plainly, in the place where it occurred, by the person who was present." There was a long silence. Then Morton clasped his hands together upon his knees, looked down at them for a moment as though conducting a brief private negotiation with himself, and looked up. "Very well," said he. Chapter 9. The Reckoning of Memory. Morton spoke for perhaps 30 minutes in all. He spoke without interruption, wherein the same quiet, denuded voice with which he had uttered those 2 words of consent, and the stillness in the room during his account, had the quality of something more than mere attention. It was the stillness of people confronting a history they had each carried, from different angles and in different measure, for a very long time. He had come to Threadneedle Street on the evening of the 17th, he said, because Pembroke had sent him a letter that morning. The letter had been brief. It informed Morton that Pembroke intended to instruct his solicitor on the following day to proceed with the preparation of his corrective statement, and that he wished to speak with Morton before he did so. Not to seek his consent, which he acknowledged was no longer a consideration, but to give him warning as a matter of long acquaintance and some residual obligation. Morton had read the letter 3 times. He had then gone out and walked for 2 hours in the November cold, before returning to his lodgings, and gone out again in the evening with the ledger key that Pembroke had, many years before and in a different spirit, entrusted to his keeping as the firm's most senior remaining clerk. "How did you obtain access to the archive?" Holmes asked, the question placed with the precision of a man confirming a detail already established rather than seeking a new one. "The ledger key was mine," said Morton. "I had retained it upon my retirement. With Pembroke's knowledge, he had never asked for its return, and I had never offered it. I think neither of us examined very closely the reasons for that arrangement." A pause. "Well, I let myself in through the side entrance, to which I also retained a key from my years at the firm. I went directly to the archive. I took the ledger from the shelf. I had not fully decided what I intended to do with it." "But you had decided to enter Pembroke's office," Holmes said. "I had decided to speak with him." "Yes." Morton looked down at his clasped hands. "I had not decided anything beyond that. I told myself that if I could speak with him directly, if I could make him understand what the statement would mean for me, not only professionally, you understand, but in terms of everything remaining to me, I believed he might reconsider, or at the very least, postpone." He paused again, and the pause was long enough that the room seemed to settle by a degree around it. "He was at his desk when I came in. He was not surprised to see me. I think he had expected that the letter might produce precisely this response." Morton's voice, which had been steady, took on a slight roughness at this point, as though some abrasion had been applied to it from within. "He was not unkind. That is the thing I find most difficult to account for now, looking back upon it. He was not unkind at all. He was tired and resolved, and genuinely sorry for the position I was in. He told me he understood my fears and that he had not made his decision easily. He told me he had been carrying the matter for 25 years, and that the weight of it had become, in the time remaining to him, more than he could continue to sustain. "And the ledger," Holmes said. "You had brought it with you." "I had it under my arm. I set it on the desk between us." I told him that, without the ledger, there was no documentary foundation for his statement, that it would be dismissed as the confused recollection of a dying man, and that neither Morton nor anyone else need suffer for it. He looked at the ledger for a long moment and then looked at me, and he said something I have not been able to put out of my mind. Morton stopped, and I saw for the first time the tremor in his hands become something slightly more than the simple oscillation of age. He said, "Silas, the ledger is not the only record. I am the record. I have been the record all along, and I am tired of holding the page closed." The room was very quiet. Miss Graves had lowered her gaze. The Reverend Cole stood with his eyes fixed upon a point above Morton's head, his expression stripped, for this interval, of its professional composure. "I took a page from the ledger," Morton continued, his voice recovering its evenness with evident effort. "The page that set out the syndicate arrangement most plainly. The page that bore all 3 names and the corresponding figures. I tore it from the binding. I went to the grate and I burned it. Pembroke watched me do it. He did not stop me. I am not certain he had the strength to stop me, and I'm not certain, even now, whether his silence was consent or exhaustion or something altogether beyond either." He looked up. When the page was ash, I turned back to the desk, and he had laid his head back against the chair. His colour was wrong. I spoke to him, and received no answer. I took his wrist and found the pulse very faint and irregular. I knew what it signified. "You did not summon assistance," Holmes said. "It was not an accusation, simply a point requiring acknowledgement." Morton received it without flinching. I did not. I told myself that nothing could be done, that the end was close, regardless of intervention, that the doctor would confirm it as natural causes and no inquiry would follow. He paused. I have examined that reasoning a good many times since. I am not satisfied by it. I do not think I was satisfied by it at the time. But I left. I took the ledger, I locked the archive behind me, and I went home. Lestrade had stopped writing. He stood with his pencil suspended above the page, watching Morton with an expression I found difficult to categorize. The expression perhaps of a man who has been in his profession long enough to encounter, on occasion, a guilt that does not fit comfortably into the shapes that the law provides for it. Holmes was the first to speak after Morton had finished, and he did so without haste. "You left a man in cardiac failure without seeking medical aid," he said. "That fact must be stated plainly, and its legal consequence will be a matter for others to determine. But I wish to be equally plain about what the evidence demonstrates and what it does not. There is no physical evidence that you struck Pembroke, restrained him, or administered any substance to him. The post-mortem, which I have seen in summary, confirms cardiac failure of the kind consistent with a man of his age, condition, and the severe agitation of that evening. You did not kill him, Mr. Morton, in the sense that the law applies most gravely to that phrase. What you did was leave him to die alone, in the office where he had worked for 40 years, with the ashes of the truth he had tried to restore still warm in the grate beside him." The silence that followed this was of a different texture than those preceding it. Not the expectant silence of a room waiting for a revelation, but the heavier silence of a room in which a revelation has been made and must now be absorbed. It was the Reverend Cole who spoke next, and he spoke in a voice that had shed entirely its habitual professional measure. "Where is the ledger now, Mr. Morton?" Morton looked at him. "In my rooms, in the chest beneath my window. I could not destroy it. I told myself I would, but each morning I returned from it." He closed his eyes briefly. "I could not destroy it because Edmund's name is in it. Because for all the use I had made of that fact over the years, it was also, in the end, the only remaining written evidence that he was not solely to blame." Holmes nodded once. "Inspector Lestrade will accompany you to your rooms this afternoon, and the ledger will be recovered. I would ask you to prepare yourself for the consequences that must follow, which are real, but which are also— I say this not as a comfort, but as an observation, somewhat mitigated by the circumstances in which they arise." Morton rose from his chair with the careful deliberateness of a man who knows he will not, after this morning, move through the world in quite the same way again. He straightened his coat, picked up his hat, and turned to Lestrade with the composure of a man who has, at long last, put down a weight that was never going to become lighter. Bellamy had sat throughout in a silence that had moved, I observed, from impatience to discomfort to something that might, given time and honest reflection, mature into understanding. Miss Graves had not moved from her chair, but her face, which had worn so many careful arrangements of expression across the preceding days, was now simply open. The face of a person who has heard the truth and is permitting themselves to receive it without management. Holmes gathered the false ledger from the desk, glanced at it once with an expression of mild professional satisfaction, and set it beneath his arm. He caught my eye across the room, and his expression communicated, in the compressed and efficient manner I had come to read well over many years, that the essential work was done, and that the residue was now, in the most appropriate sense, a matter for others to attend to. I held the door for Morton as he preceded Lestrade into the corridor, and as I did so, I heard from behind me in the room the Reverend Cole speak to no one in particular, in a low voice stripped of everything except its plainest human register. "Edmund would have wanted it told," he said. No one replied, but no reply was required. Chapter 10. The Balance of Time. The weeks that followed Morton's confession moved at the deliberate pace of institutional consequence. That particular rhythm in which the law, having received its material, processes it with a thoroughness that bears little resemblance to the urgent human drama that produced it. I shall not dwell at length upon the legal proceedings themselves, which were, in the end, of less moral complexity than the events that preceded them. I set down here, rather, what became of each person concerned, and what Holmes said when it was over, because it is in his final summation, characteristically brief, characteristically exact, that the true shape of the case reveals itself most clearly. Morton was charged after some deliberation among the relevant legal authorities with the unlawful removal of the firm's property and with the willful neglect of a person in mortal distress. The latter charge representing the law's best approximation of the wrong he had done in leaving Pembroke to die without seeking assistance. The question of whether a more serious charge could be sustained was examined and set aside on the grounds that the post-mortem evidence confirmed cardiac failure as the primary cause of death, and offered no support for any more direct attribution. His solicitor was a competent man who made the most of Morton's age, his subordinate position at the time of the original fraud, and the extended duration of his silent suffering as a form of punishment already largely served. The outcome was a modest custodial sentence, reduced further on appeal, which Morton received with the composure of a man who had, in the moment of his confession, already undergone the more significant reckoning. The ledger was recovered from Morton's rooms in Bloomsbury, precisely where he had described it. In the chest beneath the window, wrapped in a length of brown cloth, its green morocco cover quite undamaged except for the gap in its binding where the torn page had been removed. Lestrade's constable brought it to Baker Street before it was entered into evidence, at Holmes's request, and Holmes spent an hour with it at his desk, in a silence I did not interrupt. When he set it aside, he said nothing immediately, and I did not ask him what he had found, because his expression told me that what he had found was not unexpected, and that he was engaged in the particular kind of reflection that does not immediately resolve into speech. The Reverend Adrian Cole resigned his trusteeship of the firm's charitable endowment within a fortnight of the events at Threadneedle Street. He wrote a letter to his bishop, the existence of which I learned of through a later conversation with Holmes, who had his own channels for such intelligence, acknowledging that his long silence on the matter of his brother's damaged reputation constituted a failure of the pastoral and moral obligations to which he had dedicated his professional life. He did not, to my knowledge, make any public statement. He retired from his London parish and went, it was said, to a small living in the west of England, where the demands of a rural congregation would afford him, perhaps, the opportunity for a quieter and more honest form of service. Horace Bellamy assumed full control of the firm with an energy that, under the circumstances, struck me initially as indecent in its promptness, but which I revised upon reflection into something more generous. He had inherited not merely a business but a tainted history, and his response was to address it directly, commissioning an independent financial review of the South Atlantic accounts, making a private settlement with the surviving relatives of Edmund Cole, and declining, when approached by a journalist who had heard whispers of the affair, as to offer any comment that would further damage the reputations of the dead. These were not the actions of a calculating man protecting an asset. They were, I came to believe, the actions of someone genuinely chastened, a man who had been shown at close proximity and in considerable detail what the concealment of inconvenient truth costs across a generation, and who had decided he did not intend to pay the same price. Miss Eleanor Graves remained at the firm. Bellamy offered her, within a month of assuming control, the title of office manager, a position carrying responsibilities commensurate with the work she had in practice been performing for years under a lesser designation. She accepted without ceremony. I encountered her once some months afterward at a lecture on archival methods at the Society of Antiquaries, and we exchanged a few pleasantly unremarkable words about the evening's subject. She did not mention Pembroke or the case, and neither did I, but there was in her manner a settled quality, a sense of someone occupying their circumstances without the quiet friction of suppressed knowledge, that had not been present when I first observed her across Pembroke's supper table. It was on a January evening some 6 weeks after Morton's conviction that Holmes finally offered me his considered view of the whole affair. We were at Baker Street, the fire well established against a sharp frost, and I had been rereading the notes I had kept throughout the case with the intention of shaping them into some written form. Holmes had been at his violin, not playing with any particular intention, but moving through a sequence of low and reflective passages that I had come to associate with the aftermath of cases that had left some residue upon him. He set the violin down, crossed to his chair, and sat with his elbows upon his knees and his gaze directed at the fire rather than at me. "I have been considering Morton," he said after a silence of some minutes. "In what respect?" "In the respect that he is, of all the people involved in this affair, the one most difficult to assess with any satisfaction." Holmes picked up his pipe, examined it, and set it aside. Pembroke was guilty of the original fraud and of a belated conscience, both of which are entirely human, and the latter of which was, in its way, courageous. Cole was guilty of a silence that cost his brother everything, and he has paid for it in the only currency available to a man of his character, which is self-knowledge. Bellamy was guilty of nothing beyond an incautious ambition and a temporary willingness to accept explanations he ought perhaps to have questioned. Miss Graves was guilty of nothing at all. He paused. But Morton falsified the records at another man's instruction. He spent 25 years carrying that as a private burden. He acted on the evening of the 17th from terror rather than malice. And the terror was the terror of an old man watching the last remaining protection between himself and ruin dissolve before him. And yet, he left Pembroke in that chair. I considered this for a moment. You think he might have saved him? I think it is possible that prompt assistance might have made a difference. I cannot say it would have. The heart was in an advanced state of failure, and the outcome might have been identical regardless. Holmes looked away from the fire and towards the window, where the frost had patterned the glass in its elaborate, indifferent geometry. What I think with rather more confidence is that Morton knew he might make a difference and chose not to try. That choice is the thing that resists easy categorization. It was not murder. It was not precisely abandonment in the coldest sense. It was the decision of a terrified man at the extreme limit of his endurance. And I find that I can analyze it without difficulty and understand it without particular effort. But I cannot, even now, assess it with the clean satisfaction that resolution usually affords. He was quiet for a moment, and the fire settled, and the frost continued its silent work upon the window. "You have said before," I offered, "that when a man has been carrying a weight for long enough, the weight becomes part of his structure. That removing it too suddenly is its own kind of violence. I have said something of the sort." Holmes's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but the particular relaxation of feature that served him for one when the occasion was thoughtful rather than light. Pembroke understood that. It was why he gave warning before proceeding. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had made a cruel arrangement and spent the remainder of his life growing toward the courage to undo it. A pause. He very nearly had enough time. I wrote that down, as I wrote most things Holmes said when the day's urgency had passed, and he was thinking aloud without restraint. Outside, Baker Street lay silver and still under the January frost, just the lamplight falling quiet and even upon the pavement, the city reduced by the cold to its simplest and most fundamental self. Holmes reached for his pipe again, and this time filled and lit it, and leaned back in his chair with the long exhalation of a man releasing a case finally and completely. "A man may alter his books, Watson," he said through the first drift of smoke, "but he cannot amend the arithmetic of conscience. The figures wait patiently for their reckoning." He said nothing further that evening, and I did not require him to. I turned back to my notes, and the fire burned on, and the frost held the city in its clean, impartial silence, and the case of the vanished ledger was, at last, complete.